Been a part of the Western United Credit Union for the past 25 years. A friend introduced me to the credit union. A friend told me to go and join.
My first introduction or first knowledge of the credit union, well, there was a co-worker of mine, his name was Kapok. This partner of mine told me, come down there, have a good credit union, and they have a lady named Miss Yearwood. When you go and you talk to Miss Yearwood and you explain to her what you're doing, she will listen to you and she's going to help you. I was interested because at that time, as a young man, recently married, have kids, and looking to get ahead, and knowing that, of course, working with the corporation, the money wasn't all that big. But at least if they could help me to get something, I'd appreciate that. So I did really go to Miss Yearwood, and just as what was said about her, she was like a mother. You know, you go to a mother and you explain the situation. Well, most of us were building back in those days. So we'd go to her and say, Miss Yearwood, look, we're doing some construction, we want to build our home and we want some assistance. She said, okay, bring your bills, bring what you have. And she was able to help us. She listened to us, understand what we were doing, and was able to really help us. And since that time, over 37 years ago, you know, I have stuck with the credit union. You know, it has helped me apart from building my home. I was able to, you know, get assistance like in buying, well, appliances for the home. And throughout the years, you know, they have really assisted me and my family. Not only me, but a lot of the guys could have testified that she was like the mother, you know, for all of us as young men. Because to go to a bank to ask for money and they had to come with so much different documents and different facts and different things to prove what it is they really wanted for. As a credit union, you know, they made it much easier for us. But at least going there, explaining the situation, bringing your receipts, bringing your estimates, and of course paying back. And this is what most of us were able to do. As we were able to pay back, then it was even easier now for us to even get more, you know, as time went by.
My name is Michael Scipio and I am one of the young members of the Western United Credit Union. I've been a part of Western United for about 4 years now, and throughout this journey with the credit union, I have learned so much. From actually being a part of the youth arm of the credit union, I've learned so many things about being able to properly manage money. The credit union itself has really impacted me in many different ways of my personal and financial life. And that's actually one of the things that I appreciate so much about this credit union, that they don't just look after your finances, but they actually care about the individual itself. Being a rugby player and commuting to and from national training and knowing that my car shut down today and I could go to the credit union and explain to them my situation and get the funding and finances I need to fix my vehicle. To have that kind of support is really imperative as a national athlete, to know that you're not fighting your battles alone. This credit union has been a really big help for me, and the support that you get here is like no other. A lot of these battles you normally have to fight for yourself, but with the support of a credit union like Western United, being a part of this environment, it's relieving to know that you're not fighting your battles alone. The family bond that they create really shows what the credit union movement is about. And this is one of the few places that you actually get that. It takes a load off of your shoulder knowing that a credit union like Western United could support you.
My name is Bruce George. I have been associated with credit unionism for in excess of 35 years. I had the privilege of serving as a member of the board of directors, as a member of the credit committee. I am pleased to have been associated with the credit union movement because they have given me what I would consider life skills. For instance, where I live, it's on a hill, and the problem we were having was with a regular supply of water in the pipeline. There were times we would be with water, and there are times we would have been without water. I approached the credit union and got a loan and purchased 5 storage tanks so that I would have water when there was no water available in the lines. There was another occasion in which I was experiencing some leaks on my roof, and without a bother, I was again able to get the required assistance from the credit union. The credit union movement, I think, gives you the impetus to save, and that was something that I have benefited from tremendously, just the habit of saving. I want to put that out to all credit union members. Saving is important, and as long as you save, it will grow. And the more you have saved, the better are your chances if you need to get a loan which is substantial.
I was introduced to the credit union by a friend of mine named Mr. Superville. Would have been around 1997. Financial advice wasn't forthcoming, and I'd been a young soldier and so on. At that time, Mr. Superville, he being a member of the Defense Force as well, and a member of the Western United Credit Union. We were talking about life goals and so on, life skills and so on. And he mentioned the credit union to me, so I got involved and I went to Western United Credit Union, my people, so I was able to buy a vehicle, renovate my house. They're always there, ready to assist. I remember having to buy a vehicle for my brother-in-law, and assist him in his agricultural business and so on. And I went to them. I gave them the particulars that they required, and it was a go from there. He got his vehicle. I'm glad I was able to do that for him because of Western United Credit Union. He's no longer dependent, so to speak, on anyone. He's independent. His business is going well. As a matter of fact, he's in a position now to assist others as well. When I would not get any support from the bank, I would have gotten it from Western United Credit Union.
My name is Brian Johnson. I work in PICS as a senior technician. And what makes me know about the Western United Credit Union is my close friend Travelin Hall, who was saying about a credit union, a good credit union. I was trying. I started to think about it, and I said, all right, I'll go and try it out and check them out. And when I joined, they have webinars, Zoom meetings, and they have me a part of it. How to deal with issues, how to invest in money, how your money will grow, how to finance, how to budget. And always thinking about to educate you, to put you in schools if you want to elevate yourself. As a new member in the Western United Credit Union, I see a lot of improvements because in my experience and others, I was in another credit union before, I never get that type of forward or attention and make me see how real they are, how they're really concerned about the life and the family issues. I feel welcome by the people who work in the organization. I thank God for Mr. Mark, who is the president of the Western United Credit Union, helping me and guiding me for my future, for my children. Those are the ones who really there for me and my family.
My name is Katia Kane. I've been a part of the Western United Credit Union for the past 25 years. A friend introduced me to the credit union. A friend told me to go and join. Let's go and join them, there is help. There is help for people. And at that time, I was a young girl having 2 children, really in turmoil, in real turmoil. And I had a business. And it had times where the business was down. And I went to the credit union and I talked to them and they tell me, well, just bring all the bills from the shop, all your bills and everything. Bring all your bills and we'll help you. They have a lot of things they help me with. Because when my son got in trouble, they were there for me, they helped me. It was a tough time. They were very good to me. At times when I go to the credit union, sometimes I leave home. I know my next meal coming from and I walk straight into the credit union and they were there. They were there for me. And one of the persons I want to talk about is Mark. Mark has been there side by side with me. He's a very warm, genuine person. Once you see a start to go down a bad road, you have 2 faces, you know. One here is real nice, and one here, as you start to go off course, he will pull you up with the other face and let you know, well, that is not the way. Pull back. You could do better than that. The credit union has been good to me. Have me standing on my feet. I can't go hungry with the credit union, with that Western United Credit Union. Can't go hungry. They always show me love, always try to help me in whatever way. You know, so I will invite anybody to join the credit union. I will invite them to join it because they know what they're doing there. I love them all.
A pleasant good evening to you all, and welcome to today's discussion, Understanding Property Tax in Trinidad and Tobago. This discussion is brought to you courtesy Western United Credit Union, Co-operative Society Limited, and Kapok Hotel. This evening, you will gain valuable insights from Colin Ramsey, partner at Ernst Young. With over 24 years of experience, Colin guides domestic and international clients through tax complexities in Trinidad, Tobago, and Guyana. His expertise in property tax, value-added tax, and strategic planning ensures clear and efficient tax strategies. Also joining us is Reisa Young, a seasoned expert at Ernst Young with over a decade of experience. Specializing in pay-as-you-earn, VAT audits, and tax compliance, Reisa provides valuable guidance to clients in various industries, expertly handling tax returns and disputes. Together, Colin and Reisa will simplify property tax complexities for you. At this time, we would like to take this special opportunity to introduce our host for this exciting discussion, Mark A. Ferrette, President of Western United Credit Union, an inspiring lecturer, entrepreneur, advocate for superior customer care, and credit union and cooperative societal specialist. Mark has over 38 years of cooperative management experience. Welcome, Mark.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and I am your host for this evening's discussion, Mark A. Ferrette, President of Western United Credit Union. And I welcome all of you to this evening discussion entitled Understanding Property Tax. We are streaming live from the Saman Room at the Kapok Hotel, where it is very warm and welcoming at this hotel, and we would like to thank management and staff. We would also like to thank the directors for sponsoring this evening's event. And we are situated at number 16 to 18 Cotton Hill Road, Sinclair, Port of Spain. And as is customary, before we go into our discussion, we would like to set the tone for this evening. And as usual, if you're accustomed attending any one of our webinars, you should know by now that we always invite the Holy Trinity in our midst. We always say a prayer as we begin any event that we are hosting. So I will just like you all to take a moment and bow your heads and close your eyes as we invite the Holy Trinity to be the guide for this evening's discussion. So in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, Amen. Come, Holy Spirit, come. Come into our discussion as we gather to discuss matters of property tax. We seek your guidance and wisdom. Illuminate our minds with clarity, fairness, and compassion. Help us consider the needs of all, balancing the burdens of taxation with the well-being of our community and the entire country, Trinidad and Tobago. May your presence guide our discussions as we empty our minds from the noises both internal and external to ourselves, for the benefit of all, and may justice prevail in all things. All this we ask in the mighty name of Jesus. Amen. Come, Holy Spirit, come. So once again, welcome. Once again, we thank our sponsors. And before we introduce our panelists this evening, we just want to clarify and put out a disclaimer. And the disclaimer is, ladies and gentlemen, is that this evening's discussion on property tax is to provide purely information and to bring you, our viewing audience, the facts as it relates to property tax. It is in no way constitutes official advice or guidance from any government, entity, or political party. The discussion this evening is simply to edify all of us, you, the viewing audience, us here in the studio, and to alleviate any concerns or fears that we may have as a society about property tax. This has absolutely no influence from the government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. And once again, it is just a simple family conversation that we will be having this evening to seamlessly bring light to this tongue twister, controversial topic that we have hearing bantering around. So this evening, we have with us Mr. Colin Ramsey, tax partner from Ernst Young, and Ms. Reisa Young, tax staff from Ernst Young Global Limited. Welcome, guys, and thank you for your time, and thank you for your expertise as we kick off this discussion on property tax this evening. Reisa, welcome.
Thank you.
Colin, welcome.
Thank you.
And Reisa, don't get jealous. But what makes this discussion or this webinar even more exciting is this is my alma mater here. You understand?
Yes.
So St. Francis College is in the house.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
100%.
100% in the house this evening. So Colin, welcome.
Thank you.
So, with all of that being said, and the little tongue twister there with the controversy. We want to dive into it one time because there's a lot to discuss on property tax, and we want to have clarity. We want to bring a sense of peace to people's mind as to what is property tax. And Colin, I'm going to start off with you asking you that question. So, Colin, what is property tax?
All right, so firstly, good night to you, Mark, once again, and good night to all the viewers. I'm certainly very grateful for the opportunity to be here today, to be able to impart some knowledge and clarify any misunderstandings on property tax. I certainly hope that we are able to get through today's proceedings in a reasonable time, so that if there are additional questions, they could be asked, but if not, we remain contactable. I know Mark has our contact details, so any further questions, feel free to direct it to Western Credit Union, and I'm certain it will reach on to us accordingly.
Certainly.
So on the issue of property tax, I will say that in the context of Trinidad and Tobago, property tax is a tax that is imposed on land. And land is actually defined to include all land, including land covered by water, as well as all buildings and all attachments to buildings, structures, different things on a building, on land attached to the building and affixed to the land, etc. So for all intents and purposes, property tax in Trinidad and Tobago is really a tax on land and buildings.
Land and buildings. That is, in essence, what property tax is. So my next question to you, Colin, would be, in this controversy that has been bouncing around the society in terms of why property tax and why property tax now, and some persons are of the view that the property tax being introduced is an oppressive measure by the government, and it will further maybe impoverish the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. So my next question to you would be, is property tax a global taxation? Meaning, is it a tax that is throughout the world, or is it unique to Trinidad and Tobago?
That's a great question, Mark. Property tax is certainly not something new to Trinidad and Tobago. And let me clarify that in its current incarnation, property tax is governed by two pieces of legislation principally: the Property Tax Act 2009, as well as the Valuation of Land. Those two pieces of legislation work in tandem with each other for the purpose of assessing property tax. Prior to the introduction of the Property Tax Act 2009, property taxes were present in Trinidad in a different form for several decades. And those taxes were imposed under the Land and Building Taxes Act, as well as Part 5 of the Municipal Corporations Act. The bases and the rates were different from what we see existing currently. However, to answer your question, property tax is certainly not something new to Trinidad. And in relation to the other part of the question as to whether it exists around the world, certainly we have seen property taxes in many jurisdictions across the Caribbean, albeit there are nuances in each specific jurisdiction. But to answer your question, yes, property taxes, it's not unique to Trinidad. It is something that exists across the region.
Okay. And I'm going to throw this one to you, Reisa. So we have clarified what is property tax, and we have clarified that property tax is not meant to impoverish any citizen in any country. It is a taxation that is global. I believe that all countries throughout the world would have property tax, and later down in the discussion, we will get into why property tax and its benefits to the citizenry of any country. So, Reisa, I want to ask you the question. What are the various property classes, and what is the rates of those taxes that are applied to the very classes in terms of property tax?
Okay, sure. Well, property tax is essentially levied at various rates, and the rate depends on the industry, or the class, sorry. First, you have the residential, which is 2%. It was actually decreased from 3% recently with the amendment of the Act. You have the industrial side, whereby you have 6%, and then 3% for open air plant and machinery. Then we have commercial at 5%, agriculture at 1%. But I think it should be instructive to note that currently only the residential rates for the property tax will be enforced. Currently, however, at some point in the future, they may revisit the other classes.
And that raises a question in my mind, and I either one of you guys can answer it, because I will ask questions not only for myself, but for also the viewing population in terms of what we have been hearing behind the scenes and what they would want to know and learn, so that at least their fears could be put to rest. So some persons may ask, well, why start at the residential? I hope I'm not throwing a curveball at you guys here this evening. But some persons may ask, okay, well, fine. We have the different classes. We have the different rates attached to the different classes of property tax. Why start residential?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. And to be honest, I don't think it's one that we could really answer, because it's driven by a policy decision, to be quite honest. For property tax to take effect, there's a requirement that at least 50% of the properties are valued and included on the valuation rule. Okay, and we were advised by announcements made by the Minister of Finance that that threshold would have been met for the successful reintroduction of property tax under the Property Tax Act 2009. Residential, as Reisa would have gone through, has one of the lower rates, apart from the agricultural rate, which is 1%. And perhaps it was felt that the property tax be start with the residential for the purpose of rolling out and dealing with any teething issues, because when we go to other categories, such as industrial, you realize that there are still some uncertainties around, for example, valuation bases for levying property tax on certain types of assets. You know, what value do you ascribe to the particular assets for the purpose of calculating the tax? So perhaps residential may have provided a less complex basis for the purpose of starting with the reintroduction of property tax, and that would be my best guess as to why it was started with residential.
With residential. So you heard it for yourself, folks. So it is not to say that it choosing the residence for any particular reason, but it's just a matter of they were chosen because it might be a bit easier to roll out, and seeing that it hasn't been always there in terms of the calculation. I'm just saying. Correct. So Reisa, I just want to come back to you in terms of why paying property tax important to any country.
Well, ideally, even though the BIR even though they would be assessing the property tax, the funds will be provided to the municipal corporations. And then they, in turn, will ensure that we have better essential services for instance, the paving of the roads, as well as garbage collection, any sort of things like that.
And,
Okay.
sorry,
Go ahead, Colin.
just to add on to what Reisa just said, you know, I think when reading the newspaper that I would have seen some estimates of property taxes expected to be collected from this residential group or bracket, if we want to call it that. And it was in the vicinity of about 500 million, sorry. And that could go a long way in terms of providing funds to the municipal corporations, of course, to deliver these essential goods and services that Reisa would have described. And I also want to say that, in fairness to the public, that there will be or may be a valid expectation that on collection of these funds, we should expect or see some improvement in that level of essential services being rendered, because I think we all see that there are instances where those things may fall short at times.
So it's just a matter of holding your representative or your municipal to account for those money. Because if I remember clearly, the Minister of Finance did say that those taxes, and the Prime Minister also said that those taxes, once collected, would remain in your community to do all of the necessary works that needs to be done. So Colin, and in terms of what benefits that can be derived from property tax, we would have gone into it a bit in terms of discussing, as Reisa would have alluded to, in terms of the fixing of roads, bridges, infrastructure. Could you give us a little more clarity into the benefits of that can be derived from us, the citizenry, paying our property tax?
Well, for starters, it acts as an additional source of revenue to the government. And I think we would have all seen that in recent times, the government would have experienced deficit budgets driven by different factors. So the introduction of or reintroduction rather, of the property tax creates this additional source of revenue, which could be used for the purpose of delivering those essential goods and services. I will say, from an individual and corporate tax perspective, there is a prerequisite in the tax legislation for property tax to be paid in order to benefit from wear and tear allowance being claimed on buildings. So from a taxpayer perspective, that is one benefit, of course, that would be derived from paying property tax. And just to clarify, you know, the last time property tax would have been collected in Trinidad and Tobago would have been 2009. And there was a moratorium introduced in the Act that expired December 31st, 2023. So we have seen 14 years go by without the collection of any property tax. And as a result, the emphasis on paying property tax for the purpose of claiming these capital allowances on the buildings would not have been there, and understandably so, because it has been such a long time. But I think that is one thing that should be borne in mind, coupled with the fact that, unlike other territories that I have seen, the Trinidad tax legislation actually allows a deduction in computing chargeable profits for taxes paid, rates and taxes paid in relation to properties or buildings. So that is an additional benefit for the corporate or individual taxpayers. The case may be that may be engaged in a trade or business and using that property, which may qualify for capital allowances or tax depreciation, which we call wear and tear allowance in our world, right, for the purpose of reducing their chargeable profits. So those are, at the individual or corporate level, some benefits to be derived. Of course, from a macroeconomic level, the collection of the funds could be used toward the municipal corporations. And just to make the point that the Board of Inland Revenue is the institution responsible for imposing or issuing the assessment notices, etc. But the Act was actually recently amended to allow the collection of the taxes to take place at the municipal corporations, because we are aware that the funding will be used toward those municipal corporations in the delivery of the essential goods and services we described.
So improve schools, improve roads,
the paving, garbage collection, and those things.
All those things. So Colin, as we are there on that, there are 5 facts about property tax that I think that the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago should know about. Can you quickly walk us through those 5 facts that will give us a greater appreciation of property tax?
Yeah, well, I'll be very clear with you, Mark. There are many facts about property tax we could go through, much more than 5. But if I had to put myself in a individual situation, as I would, because I am not exempt from property tax, even though I would like to be, but I'm just kidding. But the reality of the situation is, I would think, what are 5 critical things I need to know? Well, the first thing is, what is the process for the issuance of the assessment, or how do I go about paying this tax? And the current legislation provides for an assessment notice to be issued by the 31st of March during the year that the property tax becomes due and payable. As we discussed previously, the property tax is intended to be applied to residential properties commencing this year. So under the current legislation, the 31st of March is the due date for the issuance of the assessment notices. Now, recently, I think we would have all seen in the media that there was some hold or some halt on property tax.
Yes.
And the government would have gone ahead and passed amendments to the legislation to allow for these assessment notices to be issued on or before 30th of June this year only. For other years, it goes back to the 31st of March deadline. So the assessment notices need to be issued by 31st of March. You, the taxpayer, then have 6 months to pay the property tax. So you have until 30th of September to pay the tax. Now, the legislation was also amended to allow the Board of Inland Revenue to extend the deadline for anything that is required under the Act to be done, so that if they so choose to extend that 30th of September deadline, the legislation empowers them to do so.
Yes.
But as it currently stands, the deadline for that payment is 30th of September. The third thing I would ask myself is, how do I calculate this property tax? Well, the property tax, as Reisa mentioned, for residential purposes is levied at the rate of 2% on the annual rateable value of a property. What is that? You may ask yourself. Well, annual rental value is the rent that you expect to collect from a property minus 10% for voids or what have you. So if we were to take a simple example of somebody who pays or whose property rents for $5,000 per month, on an annual basis, that equates to $60,000. We then have to reduce that amount by 10%, which brings the figure down to $54,000. 2% of that $54,000 gives me $1,080 annually in property tax that is due.
So it's not to say that I can start to cold sweat saying it's $54,000 that I have to pay.
Well, that is your point.
Yes.
So, and when you take the $1,080 using that example of a property that could run for $5,000, you get a monthly amount of $90. $90 per month,
Yes.
right?
Which makes it more manageable.
Which makes it more manageable. So, I think it's important as a citizen to understand that. I mean, the fourth point that I found was very important. The fourth point is, what if I don't pay on time? Then what fines and penalties do I incur? And interestingly, the Act actually provides for a penalty of 10%, which will accrue once you fail to pay by the 30th September deadline, as well as interest at 15% per annum on the increased sum. So it would essentially be the tax and the penalty. The fifth thing, which I think would be very important for the population to know, everybody's focusing on what they have to pay out. But what if the government owes you? In other words,
Yes.
if you paid property tax, and Reisa correctly mentioned the rate reduced from 3% to 2%. And I am aware of people who actually paid at the 3% rate. So what that means is that they would have overpaid property tax for this year. So the legislation was actually amended to allow the government to offset the property tax overpayment against any other taxes you may owe, or refund you the amount. Now, if they fail to refund you the amount within 6 months of it becoming due to you, then they liable to pay you interest at 6% per annum. Now, it's interesting because that amendment to 6% per annum is fairly recent. Previously, it was 1.2% per month, which equates to like 14.4% per annum. But be that as it may, 6% return on a refund that is owed for you for more than 6 months is not bad. So that's the fifth point I think is important to know.
So there we have the 5 points, and you kind of touch on one of the questions that I wanted to ask. Like what happens if you don't pay your property taxes? Talk about lien on the property if the debt is not paid off, and what can the government sell your home, and what process? I think maybe we can go in a little more about that, because I fail to pay.
Right.
And now I understand that the government can have a lien on my property.
Right.
Is it that I am going to get up one morning and realize that the government is knocking on my door and I no longer have a home? Or is there a process that we go through in terms of, okay, I didn't pay, the government would then send me a letter or a notice, and how long do I have to pay? Can I pay now by monthly installments, or how does that process operate in terms of not paying your property tax, and what can be done to a citizen who do not pay their property tax intentionally?
So very good question, Mark. I will start by saying that, and I'm sure we're going to get to this, but there are provisions within the Property Tax Act to deal with instances where persons experience hardship or in impoverished circumstances and are not in a position to pay the property tax in a timely manner. But for those who are in a position to pay, but willingly or purposefully refuse to pay, then the penalty and interest that I would have described is the first thing that would accrue. Now, where 6 months would have passed from the time the tax became due and payable, then the Board of Inland Revenue may issue a demand notice for that particular arrears that are now due to them. Now, subsequent to issuing that demand notice, if 12 months have then elapsed, then the board may levy a distress against the chattels or belongings of the taxpayer for the purpose of satisfying that arrears of property tax owed. Now, where more than 5 years have then elapsed from the time the tax becomes due and payable, then the President may issue a warrant for the seizure of the property. But of course, that final measure is after all of these other steps that I would have described would have taken place. So it is not a situation where automatically your property becomes seized by the government. There are steps, there are different courses that will be taken before it reaches to that stage. And even when it reaches to that stage, there are provisions in the law that allow the taxpayer to, respond to that type of distress or warrant that may have been issued in the circumstances.
In circumstances, so as you are given an opportunity to maybe enter a contractual agreement with the government to see how best you can repay. Of course, there's always interest that is added on to.
That is, yes, yeah.
That is it. That's
correct, because the 10% penalty that I alluded to, that's a fixed amount. But the interest is 15% per annum. So in 10 years' time, we're talking about 150%, 1.5 times what your tax assessed was. And then that is just 1 year we're dealing with. What about other years? Because remember, property tax is levied annually.
Yes.
So for every year, we're talking about the tax plus the interest and the fixed penalty.
I want to move on, and I want to kind of throw the ball here at Reisa now,
Sure.
in terms of, I guess, just once again to bring some clarity in terms of the benefits and the importance of property tax, and how does a citizen contributing to their country through property tax, how does it benefit the economy of Trinidad and Tobago?
Okay, sure. Well, as Colin would have said earlier, it increases the revenue for the government. He also mentioned that they would have estimated annually 500 million
for residential alone.
Collections. So that, I mean, just imagine what that can do. We have our roads that need fixing. We have a lot of roads that need cleaning up.
Yeah.
We even have a lot of areas that don't have roads currently.
Correct.
So it could contribute to all of that.
And my reason for that is just to drive the point home again, the importance of us as citizens of the country making a concerted effort to factor it into our budget to ensure that we pay our property tax. In terms of stamp duty, Colin, I want to go to stamp duty, and how does this interplay with property tax?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, Mark. So for the benefit of all non-tax people, stamp duty is actually levied on the conveyance or transfer of, land and buildings, shares, and different types of instruments, okay? And it's levied under the Stamp Duty Act. Currently, if someone transfers or sells residential property, stamp duty is imposed at a rate of circa 7.5%. Now, when you compare stamp duty in Trinidad to other parts of the Caribbean, you find that the rates in those other jurisdictions are comparably lower than that in Trinidad and Tobago. So, for example, in Guyana, the rate of stamp duty on the transfer of buildings or land is like 2% versus 7.5% in Trinidad. And whilst we commend the government for, amended the Stamp Duty Act for first-time homeowners and increasing that threshold on which stamp duty is payable to the first $2 million, no stamp duty. I mean, I think that was a welcome measure, and we must commend the government on that measure. I still believe that with the reintroduction of property tax as a means of possibly easing the burden on the taxpaying public, that consideration ought to be given to the rate of stamp duty being reduced, in light of the fact that we have this property tax which the citizenry now have to contend with. And the fact that when you look at the other jurisdictions where stamp duty exists, by and large, we haven't seen it cross 4%.
Thanks very much for that clarification, Colin. And if someone disputes an assessment done by the government in terms of their property and property tax, what is the process to register such a disagreement?
Right. So, as I mentioned, the Property Tax Act is imposed under two pieces of legislation: the Property Tax Act 2009 and the Valuation of Lands Act. So in the first instance, where you object on the basis of the valuation, you are to register that objection in writing. And there's a particular form that you must complete in order to register that objection. It is not a case of writing a letter to the particular body, the valuation office. It is actually a form you complete where you tick your basis of disagreement with the valuation. Interestingly, Mark, the deadline for objecting to the valuation under the Valuation of Land Act extended from 30 days to 6 months. So a taxpayer has more time to object under the Valuation of Land Act. Now, under the Property Tax Act, where you receive an assessment that you are not in agreement with, then you have basically 21 days to object to that assessment. And that objection must be done in writing as well. If I'm not mistaken, under the Act, the Board of Inland Revenue has a certain amount of time to determine that objection as well. I believe that period is 12 months to determine the objection, failing which it is deemed to be determined in favor of the taxpayer. So,
can you kindly repeat that last part? Yeah. I'm sure. I'm sure a few audience might like to hear that again.
Okay, no problem. So I'm saying under the Property Tax Act, where a person objects, the Board of Inland Revenue has a specific period of time in order to determine that objection, failing which the objection is deemed to be determined in favor of the taxpayer. So if they fail to essentially conclude on the objection within that period of time, and their determination is dated on, well, after that period of time, which, if memory serves correct, is 12 months, then the taxpayer wins, essentially.
Essentially.
Yeah. Well, I think it's also important to note that if the objection is determined by the Board of Inland Revenue within the prescribed time, and if the taxpayer remains aggrieved by the decision of the board, there are provisions within the Act to allow for the matter to be escalated to the Tax Appeal Board and then to the Court of Appeal, etc. So there is recourse for the taxpayer.
For the taxpayer, so it's not a one and done.
Yes, it's not that you object and they determine it and they said, well, we don't agree with you, here, pay us our tax. You have further recourse.
Further recourse. And I think that is important to hear as well as a citizen. So it's not just say, okay, fine, that's it. We assess the property correctly, and your rebuttal is null and void, it's just ignored, it's just filed, but you can now go further, step further to appeal. And we would have discussed earlier in terms at the very beginning where we would have established that property tax is not a unique thing or a unique taxation to Trinidad and Tobago. As a matter of fact, we would have also said that this is a global taxation. Countries around the world pay property tax. In addition to right in the Caribbean, we would have also have other Caribbean islands paying property taxes. What I want to ask you, Reisa, in terms of other Caribbean islands who are engaged in paying property taxes, and maybe Colin, you can chime in as well. Is it that these property taxes are just on land and building, or some other Caribbean countries go into taxing your assets as a form of taxation for the citizens? Which one of you want to take the lead on this one?
It's fine. I believe that whilst in Trinidad, it's on immovable property. Throughout the Caribbean, it's also on immovable property. So even on your personal assets like your cars, even your bank accounts, they levy the property tax on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, and just, I think that's a good point, Reisa. I mean, we wouldn't be able to speak to every jurisdiction across the Caribbean on their particular property tax regime, because if there's one thing you learn in tax very quickly is that the concepts are very similar, but there are nuances to each jurisdiction's particular tax regime, so it varies. But I could speak to Guyana, as you would have mentioned at the beginning, that I also do advise clients on Guyana matters. And in Guyana, property tax is actually viewed as a wealth tax. And the reason it is viewed as a wealth tax is because it is levied essentially on the balance sheet of the individual or the company, meaning all assets, including cash and bank balances, motor vehicles, plant and equipment, buildings, land, receivables, intellectual property, intangible assets. All of these things form part of your asset base for the purpose of computing property tax in Guyana. Now, you are allowed to deduct any debts that were incurred for the purpose of your particular trade, business, or circumstance. So it would be your assets less those liabilities that are deductible for property tax purposes. But I think this raises a very interesting point, which is that under for example, as we are on the topic of Guyana, the rates are comparably lower than Trinidad. So as Reisa mentioned, currently in Trinidad, we have residential reduced from 3 to 2%. We have commercial at 5%. We have industrial at 6% and open air at 3% and agricultural at 1%. In Guyana, the property taxes do not exceed 1%. So the first 40 million Guyanese dollars actually has no property tax. And for everyone's benefit, if you use an exchange rate of 200 Guyanese to $1, that 40 million equates to, I think, about 200,000 US. Now, on the next 20 million, you pay property tax at 0.5%. And then anything over 60 million Guyanese dollars, you pay tax at 0.75%. So the rates are lower, but when you think about the base on which property tax is levied, it is a broader basis, not just, as Reisa mentioned, immovable land and building. It is a wider base. So whilst
you look at my statement of affairs
correct,
as an individual,
correct,
and based on what monies I may have as in my bank account, and I'm saying here unit trust shares, my fixed deposit, whatever, I am taxed on that in addition to my immovables. That's what I'm hearing?
Absolutely correct. Your financial affairs is the correct way to describe it. This is essentially your balance sheet. All of your assets minus your liabilities is what is assessed. And so the rates, even though they are lower, the tax may be seen in some instances as more onerous because of that base, comparably.
Okay. So we can safely say that we are safe for now in Trinidad and Tobago in terms of not. Anyway, I wouldn't go there.
Well,
I wouldn't go there. All right.
We dealing with land. That's the takeaway. Yes, land is defined as land, including land covered by water and buildings and all structures and
Yes.
things affixed to a building or affixed to land or that type of thing. So.
I want to move on to, and I hope this discussion this evening to our viewing population, not only the membership of Western United Credit Union Co-operative Society Limited, but the broader society throughout Trinidad and Tobago. I hope that this discussion this evening is adding value. It is addressing your concerns, alleviating your fears, whatever fears you may have in your mind, in terms of this property tax that, as Colin would have said very clearly, property tax is nothing new to us in Trinidad and Tobago. We have always paid it. It's just under another name. And before I knew it as land and building taxes. Yes.
And house rates as well.
Yes.
Yes.
So it is nothing new, people. It's just it's a different calculation.
Correct.
And it just means that maybe when it is calculated and we know exactly how much we have to pay, we now have to sit with ourselves or sit with our families and say, okay, fine, how am I going to meet this yearly obligation in a very affordable, organized manner? So instead of saying, okay, fine, annually I have to pay $1,000 and something, instead of waiting until that due date reaches, we can simply calculate, as you would have done earlier, what or how much do I have to pay on a monthly basis, and put that money aside or pay it on a monthly basis. So when the September you had mentioned?
Yes.
When that time comes, I would have paid my property tax already. And that is one way that we can address it and not having it feel so burdensome, for want of a better word. So Reisa, I am a senior citizen.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
And you want to put property tax on. So as a senior citizen, am I eligible for a property tax exemption? And Colin, you can answer this as well, both of you, because we are talking about exemption of property tax because I am a senior citizen. And you know, as we get older, a lot of friends are invited as well. It is one thing to be getting older, but leave the friends aside. You know, the arthritis and all the, right? But
all the complications.
Yeah, all the complications, but it's the friends that really do and truly bring all the added stress. So as a senior citizen, can I ask for an exemption? And at what age can I ask for an exemption as a senior citizen? And if I could throw in, I know it's supposed to be one question at a time. I hope my teacher isn't listening to me, but I just want to throw in a third. So can I ask for an exemption as a senior citizen? And at what age can I ask for an exemption? And Colin, I want you to answer this one. Is it an exemption, meaning that I don't have to pay it at all? Or does it pops up its head later down the road? Is it passed on to maybe my son or my daughter? So, Reisa.
Well, we won't say that it's an exemption, really. It's more like a deferral, whereby the senior citizen can apply to the board in order to have this tax deferred based on impoverished conditions.
And this is the Board of Inland Revenue, is it?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
It's deferred, and I believe, from what I read from the Act, Colin, you could probably correct me if I'm wrong. From what I understand, there's a prescribed form, which I noticed is not available yet on the BR's website. They said they would make it available later on.
Right.
Once this application is made, it has to be renewed every 2 years, possibly. Yeah, I'm correct?
Yeah.
Every 2 years. And in order to submit this application, you need to submit proof of being in receipt of pension. So that could possibly answer the question as to at what age.
Yes.
Yeah, you need to be in receipt of your pension in order to apply.
So that's around 65 years of age. So I hear right away that it is not an exemption, but it is a deferral.
Correct. Yes.
Correct.
So if it is not an exemption, but a deferral, what does that mean, Colin? I just want to bring some clarity to that in terms of it's not exempted. So does it mean, as we would have alluded to, it is passed on to another generation that incurs, and does it incur an interest as we go along?
That's an excellent question, Mark. And I think Reisa answered the question quite accurately by saying it is not really an exemption, but a deferral for the payment of a property tax. And just to clarify, which Reisa would have alluded to, that deferral is not an automatic deferral. Not because you're a senior citizen means you automatically qualify for this deferral, opportunity. Essentially, as Reisa said, there's a form that one is required to complete, and you must show that you are in impoverished circumstances or going through some financial hardships in order to be considered for that deferral. Now, that's a very good question you ask. What happens if the person passes away who was granted at that deferral? Well, the Act actually provides for the property tax becoming due and payable on the death of the particular property owner who was granted this deferral. And that debt then falls to the successors of that particular person. Now, the Act also contains provisions for the successors of those persons, whereby those persons, if they find themselves in similar hardships or impoverished conditions and are not in a position to pay the tax, then they could complete the application form, which outlines certain documents that you must attach, such as if you are in receipt of any type of public assistance, if you are in receipt of any pension or any type of government funding to help you, disability grants or whatnot. And that will then be considered as part of the arrangement for the defraying of this debt that would have now materialized on the death of the owner of that particular property for which the deferral would have been given.
And I'm glad you brought up the point of social benefits, because one of my questions that I want to ask is, as a senior citizen, if I ask for a deferral on paying property tax, does it impede on any one of my benefits, like my NIS pension, my old age pension, or even my social benefits, because I am now asking the government to, well, it's not an exemption, but a deferral.
Okay.
Does that in any way compromises me getting these benefits at all?
No. To our knowledge, there is currently no provision actually within the current Act that impacts the receipt of the different forms of pension or grants that a senior citizen is eligible to receive. I just want to make one point, because in saying what you did and asking the question, it took me back to that whole issue of the debt being inherited by the successor. The Act actually allows for the president to waive or grant a partial waiver in circumstances considered to be justifiable to do so, where the debt is passed on to the successor of the person. So whilst the successor may also apply for, a similar deferral of payment as the previous person before his demise or death, the reality is, in certain circumstances, there's the right within the Act to grant a waiver or a partial waiver. And you did also ask whether penalty and interest would accrue. And I will say that under the deferral scheme, no, because you would have agreed with the Board of Inland Revenue the timeliness for settlement of this property tax from a deferral perspective.
From a deferral perspective.
Yeah.
Okay. And in terms of, so my mommy or my grandmother could not have paid, so not an exemption, but a deferral. And then the successor would have inherited that debt. And now I am going through the same process of applying for, is there, and this is a kind of, this is a deferral and another deferral and another deferral from the same particular family. And therefore we are not going to entertain any further deferral, or once you can prove that my financial situation as inheriting this property remains the same or maybe even worse than my mother or my grandmother, that I would...
Let's start at that one.
I think
Correct.
everybody's situation should...
This process issued, so there is a standard process to apply for deferral. The form you complete and you supply being in this impoverished. So I will say couple will not be in a position to speak to, because the Board of Inland Revenue will know what they look at. If you look at the form as well, you will see on the flip side, for official use only, where they make their notes. It really is a case-by-case basis.
A case-by-case basis.
That's really what it boils down to.
Glad to hear that, because some persons may be wondering, okay, fine, I am now in the same position as my mother. Would I be able to, or my father, would I be able to apply for it? And in applying for it, would I be afforded the exemption or deferral? Let me use the correct word, deferral, yes, from paying the property tax. A very interesting question, and this is one that I didn't thought of, but I give the person props for thinking of this. And Reisa, do institutions such as schools or churches pay property taxes?
Oh, good news is no. No, they're exempt from it, actually. Places of worship, schools, I believe it's, just want to get the term correctly. Offices and playgrounds of schools within the meaning of the Education Act.
Correct.
Yeah. They're all exempted.
Yeah, and I mean, certain state agencies which are listed in the Act also benefit from that exemption. Other entities such as universities and so forth. So the definition of land excludes land, which obviously includes buildings, as I said, used for these purposes or used by these entities and for those purposes. So I think we answered the question quite accurately. So churches and places of worship, schools, no.
No property tax.
Yeah, within the meaning of the Education Act, as we mentioned. Yeah.
And I really thought that was a very good question to ask because, everybody is just waiting patiently for it to come on. So, you need to get yourself prepared to honor your commitment to the society. And I think we should also look at it that way as well, that it is not only for persons to say, oh my gosh, it's another property tax or it's another tax being charged against us. But for those of us who looking at the next generation to come, and you of yourself may not have anything to leave, this is a way that you can feel proud of by you honoring your property tax. It is a way of giving back to the future generation as we leave a heritage or a legacy for them to inherit.
Right.
I think that's one way to look at it. We did get some questions posted on Facebook. I think that I want to throw out one or two because it was very interesting questions that were posted on Facebook when we boosted the ads and persons, some persons were saying that there should be no property tax.
Oh no.
Why do we have to pay property tax? But there was a very interesting questions that came from a particular individual that I think it would be prudent to address.
Right.
And one was who pays property tax with respect to a property owner who built his house on squatting land?
Oh my.
Well,
now it may seem like, okay, there's an easy answer for that, right? But let's get in terms of the act, what the act has to say about that. So I built my house on state land. Who pays that tax?
Yeah. Well, we could always depend on those Facebook users to have those interesting questions, can't we? I will start by saying that when you look at the definition of who's an owner under the Act, an owner is defined to also include an occupier of the property. So a person who builds a property on squatter lands may become liable to pay the tax. Of course, subject to all those hardship provisions that we mentioned that may allow for deferral and so forth.
Also, so they, even though I am a squatter, and it is my responsibility to pay the property tax and not the government, I am hearing that I am still able to apply for a deferral.
Right, so let me just clarify.
Yes.
The property tax is levied on the owner, but the owner is defined to include occupiers, right?
Yes.
For expediency purposes, I suspect that the board will go after the owner of the particular lands for the collection of the taxes. But it doesn't mean that they don't have the ability to pursue the squatter or the person who built the property on those particular lands. You follow? So, so because the Act defines owner to include occupier, then by extension, they could be pursued. Now, there's an interesting point that I read in the Act, which alluded to the fact that not because an occupier pays property tax in respect of a building attached to land gives any legal entitlement to the land. So I think that is very important to bear in mind, that even though the government may pursue the person who constructed the property on the lands, which are described as squatter lands, as the case may be, by paying the property tax, the Act specifies that it does not create a legal entitlement to the land. So just to make that point clear.
And I think that is a very salient point, a very good point to point out, because person will say, okay, fine, since I'm paying property tax, the land belongs to me now because I'm paying property tax. I'm thinking that's what you're alluding to, that the occupier may say,
correct.
Okay.
It is possible that the person, we don't know what would be going through the minds of everyone, but certainly I could see a situation arising where someone may feel aggrieved by the fact that they may be paying property tax in respect of a structure or property that is on these squatter lands, and that they have some type of entitlement to the land. I mean, I am not a lawyer, but I will say that, of course, we go into a legal side of the whole property tax scenario to determine how many years the person has been on the land and whether legally they have entitlement. But the point I just want to make strictly from a tax standpoint is that that Property Tax Act has that provision that basically states that not because you pay property tax in respect of a structure attached to land creates legal entitlement to
the land.
I think that point is
I just wanted to drive home that a bit clearer. So another question that was asked, Colin, is if a person who has property on rented land refuses to pay the tax, does the landowner becomes liable?
Yeah. So the owner of the land, as we mentioned previously, is the one responsible for accounting for the property tax, right? Now, the Act contains provisions to allow a tenant to deduct from the rent payable to the landlord amounts in respect of property tax. So the occupier or tenant may settle the property tax through deducting from the rent payable to the particular landlord. So that brings forth the point that rental agreements need to be revisited and looked at in the context of whether the property tax is to the account of the tenant or the owner in that particular instance. Because in the absence of clarity contained within that particular rental agreement, the tenant has a right, technically, in accordance with the law, to operate in that manner and deduct from the rent payable the amount due in respect of property tax.
And we have two more questions from the person on Facebook. He said, what happens to a property owner who has failed to file the necessary documents required by law? I think we would have answered that question earlier.
Well, yes and no. So we would have alluded to the fact that if you fail to pay property tax on time, there are penal sums that could be imposed. And if you fail to address it periods after, or for a period after, there is further action that could be taken by the board. But I suspect what this person is referring to is failure to file a valuation return form or meet any obligation outlined under the Act. Now, I will say that there's a fine which is imposed on summary conviction where you fail to do these things. I am personally not aware of that fine being imposed currently. However, the law does actually allow for a fine separate and apart from the penalty and interest that we would have discussed in late payment circumstances.
In addition to the late payment, there's the fine.
Well, the fine is really specific to certain responsibilities or obligations that you fail to meet, not the payment of the property tax. The fines are separate and apart from that. So, for example, valuation return forms were issued or notifications were sent to taxpayers to complete these valuation return forms. And there was a deadline for submission. And if I'm not mistaken, even the forms would have contained wording to the effect that failure to act may lead to the government imposing this fine, and that may have been an approach taken to spur or encourage people into completing the form in a timely manner.
In a timely manner.
Yeah, but there are fines that I'm aware of in the Act, but of course it has to be on conviction, summary conviction, and it really depends on the particular circumstance, as the case may be.
And the last question actually from the person on Facebook. Are persons who occupy HDC buildings, okay,
Yeah.
I touched something, right? Buildings required to pay property tax or not?
That's a very good question. What we understand that in the case of persons who are renting or leasing, in other words, they are not the owners, that the HCC pays the tax. But in the case of people who would have acquired their units, the responsibility would go to the particular owner of the property. So it really depends on where you find yourself in that arrangement.
Whether you are a renter,
whether you are a renter or
you are
owner. You completed your payments and you are now the official owner of the property.
And I would hope that this sufficiently answered the questions of this interview, because I find that you all were very thorough in terms of the answers for this individual. Good questions.
I agree.
Yes.
Good
Very
questions.
interesting question.
Yeah. And that
Thought-provoking.
Yes, would have brought some kind of clarity in terms of being a squatter, and if you have to pay property tax, if you are an HDC owner or renter, do you have to pay property tax? And that is a very, very important question to ask, and I really do want to thank you guys for clarity. In addition to all that we have discussed this evening, I just want to go through a quick recap, but I am not going to do the recap, you know. It's both you and Reisa going to do the recap in terms of, we identified, okay, what is property tax, its importance, in terms of persons, the entries that are attached in terms of residential. I think it was 3, it has now gone down to 2%. The calculation, I would just like to go over the calculation once again in calculating your property tax, how it is done,
Right.
in terms of the government doing their assessment of what your property may be rented for, how to do that evaluation, and then let's break it down again for the viewing audience, how it is done over the period of time.
Yeah.
So, Colin?
So just to recap, you know, property tax in Trinidad and Tobago is a tax levied on land. And land is defined in the Act to include all land, including land covered by water, as well as buildings and structures attached to land. There are various categories of properties which attract different rates. So for residential purposes, the rate is now 2%. It was reduced recently from the initial rate of 3%. For commercial, the rate is 5%. Industrial, the rate is 6%. But for open air plant and machinery, which for everyone's benefit is plant and machinery not stored or housed in a building or structure, the rate is 3%. And for agricultural property, the rate is 1%. In computing property tax, it is levied on the annual rental value, ARV, as we would abbreviate it, which is really the rent which one expects to get from the property. And you know, the government would have sent out persons to do valuations of different properties and issue their valuations in respect of the properties. Before I go into the calculation, I just want to reiterate for everyone's benefit that there are provisions within the Act to dispute the assessments, whether on the basis of the valuation being incorrect or whether on the basis of the property tax being incorrectly assessed, right? And the objections take different forms. In the case of the valuation objections, they go to the valuation division, and there's a specific form that you must complete. It is not a letter that you send in. In the case of objections to the property tax assessment, it goes to the Board of Inland Revenue, right? And the time frame for objecting varies in accordance with the type of objection. So on the calculation front, the property value, the annual rental value, is what is used to assess the property tax. And there is a provision that allows for a 10% reduction from that annual rental value. So again, the example that I would have used prior to coming to the interview would have been to take a rental value of $5,000 per month and extrapolate that over a 12-month period, which gives me $60,000 in rent annually. I then apply that 10% discount factor, which reduces that $60,000 to $54,000. That is the basis on which that 2% rate is applied. When I apply 2% against the $54,000, from when I did the calculation, that figure resulted in $1,080 annually in property tax, and that is what you will have to pay for a property that is rented for $5,000 a month. If you were to take that $1,080 and spread it over a 12-month period, as Mark would have been suggesting, in order to reduce the burden, as a matter of being prudent, one may put aside money on a monthly basis. That $1,080 spread over 12 months, provided my math is correct, is $90 per month. So, all in all, I think property, there's no perfect time to introduce a tax.
Yeah.
And certainly at the point of time that we find ourselves in a country where crime is on the rise and other, factors impacting lifestyles in Trinidad, I do understand the concern of the taxpaying public. But as Mark mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, the purpose of this is not to drive political mileage in any way or anything of that nature. We really came here as tax professionals to try and educate persons, first of all, on what we consider to be key issues to be considered in relation to this property tax. And as Mark said, to alleviate fears of persons in some instances.
Yes.
And to bring clarity to recourse options available under the legislation where you may not agree to a particular assessment or valuation, as the case may be. So we do hope that we would have met these objectives. And as I mentioned, if there are any further questions beyond the cutoff time for this interview, we would be more than happy to address them subsequently.
Thank you very much, Colin, for that recap. And I think that a webinar such as this is very timely. And I want to thank, of course, the Board of Directors of Western United Credit Union for their vision and their innovation in terms of saying, well, okay, yes, let's talk property tax. Because you hear it.
Yes.
You hear it. I'm sure that you all are hearing it as well.
Yes.
People
We
are
live
very...
As tax people, there's never a day that goes by without a tax
Exactly.
question.
You understand? Because at the end of the day, persons are concerned, and of course, persons are also fearful of not being able to meet this new taxation that is being placed upon them. And how do I best manage my finances? I may be already very impoverished, I'm going through hardship. How do I mitigate this further taxation, but doing it in a way where I am going about it in the right steps? If I cannot pay, what are the steps that I can take to pay my taxes? I really do appreciate this conversation this evening, and once again, I just wanted to reiterate or to reinforce what you just said. This in no way has any political affiliation. It is in no way saying that we are here speaking on behalf of the government, but we are here to educate, to edify. As I would have said in the earlies, it is a very controversial topic, and some persons are saying, but why should we have to pay property tax? I don't think that we should be paying property tax. The government is putting hardship on persons, but you alluded to it by saying, when is the best time really that any government can say, well, here it is, property tax. That is a must. And therefore, members and the wider citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, I do hope that this webinar entitled Understanding Property Tax brought clarity to your concerns, and it would have alleviated some of your fears in terms of what if I am unable to pay my property tax? Would the government just be waiting to seize my property? I have worked so hard over the years to acquire my home that I want to leave as a heritage, a legacy, pass it down generation to generation. And now if I can't pay, I am hearing that, okay, there's a possibility that I may lose what I have worked hard for over the years. And I think that that is a fair question that any person would ask themselves, especially if you are not a wealthy person, and this is all you have to pass down to your next generation. So folks, there you have it. And I want to thank Colin and Reisa for your time and for such a meaningful, informative discussion this evening. I know that it is not going to be the end of the discussion because I am quite sure that we may need to have a further discussion based on all the questions that we would be having from the membership and maybe throughout the citizenry of Trinidad and Tobago. So guys, I want to thank you all. I also want to pay and to say particular thanks to Kapok Hotel, who has acted as our sponsors for our first two webinars within 2024. I really do want to express my gratitude, and on behalf of the Board of Directors of Western United Credit Union Co-operative Society Limited, I want to thank Kapok Hotel for their partnership. Thank the staff for their very warm and friendly welcome, and at least from the time you walk into Kapok Hotel, you feel that calm and that warmth from the time you enter the door. I really do want to say thank you very much, Kapok, and that we will be asking of you again to sponsor our next webinar. So putting in that, that request there one time.
Very timely.
Very timely. So, I am Mark A. Ferrette, President of Western United Credit Union Co-operative Society Limited. I was your host for this evening, Understanding Property Tax, and I want to bid all of you a good night. Please, if you have any further questions, you may feel free to send it to us via our WhatsApp number. Visit our website and send your questions, and they will be answered by Reisa and Colin. So thank you and good night.